In 1940, a man named Mortimer Adler wrote a classic book called How to Read a Book. So classic that, it's still in print over 80 years after it was released. More than 400 pages long, he dove deeply into how to read not only for information, but for understanding and enlightenment. So many factors enter into reading well the words that authors have put onto the page. Well, right now on Discover the Word, we're taking 4 weeks of our podcasts to focus on arguably 4 of the most influential books or writings of all time. They are the 4 accounts of the life of Jesus at the beginning of the Bible's New Testament, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if we're going to be able to read them well, not only for information, but for understanding and enlightenment, it probably would be good to have a how-to-read discussion about each of them. And so that's what we're doing in these 4 episodes of the Discover the Word podcast. We're taking 1 episode with each of the Gospels and exploring issues of authorship and audience and purpose and style and distinctives, things that will help us better know how to read its perspective on the life of Jesus. This time, our focus is on how to read Mark. And so what is it that makes the Gospel of Mark a favorite gospel among several members of the Discover the Word group? Let's find out in this edition of the Discover the Word podcast. And this is Discover the Word, the small group Bible study style Bible engagement effort of Our Daily Bread Ministries. In our last episode, Bill Crowder led Elisa Morgan and Daniel Ryan Day and Rasul Berry in doing a How to Read podcast on the book of Matthew. If you missed that conversation, I encourage you to go to our discovertheword.org website and listen. And so now this time, we turn the page and we turn our attention to the Gospel of Mark. What's different, what's the same about how he tells the story of Jesus? And what kinds of insights will help us be able to not just gain information, but be able to read with understanding and enlightenment how Mark put this gospel together. Well, let's get started and listen as Bill asks Elisa and Daniel and Rasul if they have a favorite, go-to gospel themselves, and then dig into authorship and who Mark or John Mark is.
Do you have a favorite gospel? And if so, what is it and why?
Yeah, I think John has become a favorite of mine just because in ministry so often in leading people to faith or, having new folks come to the church and they're like, where do I start? I just found it such a helpful gospel to kind of introduce people into the story of Jesus.
Yeah.
For me, it's Mark because it's short and it's fast.
Yeah.
Does that sound like Elisa?
Yeah.
She really likes the word immediately.
I do. I love the word immediately.
Yeah. Mark is my favorite as well. And it's my favorite for some of the same reasons, because it's very action-oriented, because the focus is so much on Jesus' passion. In fact, one commentary said that particularly the Gospel of Mark, but to a lesser degree, all 4 of the Gospels are passion narratives with extended introductions. If we're correct that Jesus had about a 3-year public ministry, to have in Mark's Gospel, like 12 chapters to focus on 3 years, and then the rest of the book to focus on 1 week, really shows where his emphasis is and what he's trying to lead the reader to.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that that's really kind of a helpful jumping off point for us, because what we want to do in this series of conversations, we want to think together about getting some background information that can kind of enrich your reading of the Gospel of Mark. And we've done this already with Matthew. We'll do this with Luke and John as well. But for this time, we want to focus on Mark and see what we can learn about him. And where we always start, you check any commentary, almost always the first thing they're going to talk about is authorship. And authorship's a little tricky, isn't it, Daniel?
Yeah, for most of the Bible. if not all of it. And it's at least contested in almost every case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's because the who wrote it wasn't near as important as what the message was and if it resonated and things
But it
like
wasn't
that.
unimportant.
Yeah, of course.
It's not unimportant because it does give you a window through which to understand the writing. So authorship matters. It just, I don't think we can go at it with the level of certitude that I've always wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm comfortable with that. I actually am. But I also know that there are plenty of arguments that take it in other directions. I think it's helpful just at the outset to acknowledge we don't always know everything we think we know.
Oh, so true. And we know that more and more when we get older.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why do people think that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark?
Well, I think, one thing is church tradition and, what has been passed down to us. And so as early as the 2nd century, there were attestations that John Mark wrote this gospel.
Yeah, I think that scholars refer to two kinds of evidence: internal evidence, what's in the manuscript itself, and external evidence. And that's exactly what you're talking about, Rasul, with the 2nd century church universally attributing this to Mark. And one of the reasons I'm comfortable with leaving it there is because they were a lot closer to it than we are. So I don't know how, we can have better information than they did necessarily. But there are some internal things, just to throw out a couple of ideas. And I got these from various commentaries, but just so that we know that there is stuff in the text. What we do know about the author from the text is they were familiar with the geography of Palestine because there are a lot of place names and things like that embedded in the text. Second, and this is really interesting, he knew Aramaic because he uses and explains Aramaic terms. It's sometimes hard for us to remember in a society that is so dominantly one language, English. There were at least 4 languages in operation. Aramaic was the street language of Jewish people. Greek was the language of business and commerce. Hebrew was the language of the temple. Latin was the language of government, the language that Rome had imported. And so you had people functioning on a variety of different language levels. But we know that the author knew Aramaic because he uses Aramaic terms and explains them to his audience. And he also has a good understanding of Jewish institutions and customs. So John Mark, as I believe is best understood to be the author, was a guy who was familiar. This was his home turf. He was Jewish from Palestine and very familiar with all of the Jewish customs of the day and things of that nature. If we can, for just a moment, focus on John Mark, and if we can assume that the early traditions are correct and that he was the author, who was he? What do we know about this guy, and why should we care about him?
Well, we actually did a study a while back on Discover the Word called John Mark and Company. And we looked together at relatives. His mother, Mary, was a leader in the New Testament church in Acts, a house church kind of situation. His cousin Barnabas was very familiar to us from Acts. So we get a lot of information from other people who were connected to John Mark.
Yeah.
We also know that he was at the center of at least one controversy.
Yeah, at least one.
As it relates to Paul and Barnabas,
Yeah.
that they end up separating in Acts 15 because of disagreement about John Mark.
Yeah, and the disagreement was rooted in the fact that they had taken John Mark, a young man, with them on a missionary trip, and at some point, for an unstated reason, but apparently a reason Paul wasn't buying, he went home. We don't know if maybe he had a girlfriend and he missed his girlfriend, or he missed his mom's cooking, or it may have just been he got into the middle of this thing. He said, I'm not cut out for this, and he bailed. Whatever it was, Barnabas wanted to take him a second time, and Paul kind of, in no uncertain terms, said, over my dead body.
Yeah.
And Paul and Barnabas, maybe the greatest missions team the world's ever known, split because Barnabas had some patience with human frailty that Paul did not yet have. We also know that toward the end of his life, Paul took some of that back, didn't he? In 2 Timothy 4, he says, bring Mark with you. He's profitable to me for service. And that's really helpful to see that maybe over the years, Paul was seeing, you know what, I kind of got that all wrong. He's a good dude. Bring him along with you. I like him. And so we have all those relationships added to that. Peter referred to him as my son, using the same kind of language Paul uses for Timothy.
Yeah, Peter's kind of like his mentor.
Yeah.
I mean, that language actually implies that.
Yeah, so with all this, there may be one other mention of him that he's not named, but Daniel, would you read Mark 14, verses 51 and 52? And I'll give you the context after you read it.
Sounds good. I'd love to read this. These are the stories that make me laugh in the Bible. A young man was following him, Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked.
Okay, so here's the context. This is one of the holiest moments in the Gospels. This is the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus first experiences the emotions of the passion that he's going to be enduring, and in a real tangible way hands all that over to the Father. But you say, well, what's this got to do with anything? Well, it has to do with the fact that because we believe that he got his information mostly from Peter, mostly telling Peter's stories, it's almost as if the writer is saying, this is the part that I saw. This is the part that I was an eyewitness to. And so he puts this little anonymous personal drop in.
Like who else would have known it but John Mark that this had happened?
I would say it's probably the strongest evidence of his authorship, because who else is writing this down? You know what I mean? Like, it'd be kind of mean if, somebody else, but
telling on him. Yeah.
Right. And also, I think in Mark, you see some of the most poignant and clear portrayal of the denial of Peter, which is also, I think, interesting in light of Mark's connection to Peter and dictating those things, that he's getting a very vivid and clear description.
Yeah, we're going to find that a couple of the characteristics of Mark's gospel, first of all, it has an unusual level of candor. He just kind of lays it out there the way it happened, unvarnished, and you just kind of have to take it as it was. And a lot of that has to do with quotations of Peter's exact words, especially at times when those exact words weren't really all that great, So as we get further into it, we'll talk more about the dynamic of Mark and his relationship with Peter. But for right now, let's just kind of leave it at the fact that we're going to work off the assumption that John Mark was the author of the Gospel of Mark based on the stories told to him by Simon Peter. And we'll move from that presupposition into the rest of the stuff.
All right, leading off this conversation about how to read the Gospel of Mark by talking about authorship and who wrote this account of the life of Jesus. And as Bill said, we'll talk more about who his source was for a lot of what he wrote. His likely was the first of the Gospels that was written, and Peter's role in that, I think, will be important for us to talk more about. Now, next, they're going to explore the subject of audience. Who seems to have been the primary audience that Mark was writing this account of the life of Jesus for? As always, knowing the audience is a crucial thing to look into. And so how does knowing who the primary original audience was influence our how to read Mark? Well, let's listen.
Okay, finish this sentence. When in Rome,
Do as the Romans do.
Exactly.
Which I have no clue what that means.
Well, what it means is when you're there, fit into their culture. Don't try to make them fit into your culture. You're supposed to fit into their culture. I'm not sure it's a totally valid concept, but in the ancient world, almost any place you went was Rome.
Ah.
Right. Yeah, and I would imagine that because of its central, imposing force as the center of culture, that those in the outlying areas, because even the very term barbarian was a derogatory term to talk about people whose culture didn't seem to match up to the Roman standard. So I'd imagine that as people had to do business in Rome, there might be some trepidation about, well, how do I fit in? Like, what do I do? And they probably said, well, just do whatever you see them do, just do it. And maybe you can get by without them thinking that you're, somebody that doesn't belong there.
Yeah, and dominant culture wins, right?
Yes.
Everybody else kind of has to fit to dominant culture typically. And so if that's the culture where things are happening and this is how it works, going in and being like, y'all, I think we should do things differently. And they're going to be like, good for you.
Yeah.
Enjoy
Well,
not being successful in life.
If you think about it, we employ that proverb. I'm starting to think about it, all the time.
Yeah.
You go for a job interview, you want to wear kind of what's going to be across the table from you. And, you go to your first day of school, you want to, fit. So it's all about fitting in and looking the part.
Yeah. Well, and all of that to say this, we spent our first conversation on the Gospel of Mark wrestling with the idea of authorship. But I think one of the most important things in understanding any portion of the Bible is having some kind of understanding of to whom it was written. Who is the intended audience? And how does knowing who that audience is inform what we're reading? Because the first hearers were the ones that were being written to. In a sense, the Bible was not written to us. It was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. It was written to them in those times. And so the more we know about the first hearers, the better we can understand maybe why the writer said things the way they did or didn't say things a different way, because he was trying to speak to them in their culture. And in the case of the Gospel of Mark, it's generally believed, I think, that it was written to a Roman audience. And there are a bunch of reasons for that pop up within the actual text itself. But just from what we know in general about Rome and Roman culture, how does that affect what you might expect them to be being told?
Well, it's not Jewish, so there's going to be some kind of difference in the way Jewishness is talked about.
And that's a really good point, because in Mark chapter 7, when Jesus talks about they don't eat unless they first wash the cup and the pots and all this kind of stuff, and then Mark puts in a little parenthetical explanation of the Jewish ritual of cleansing and washing. When Matthew, who was writing to a Jewish audience, talks about that same event, he gives no explanation, because he works from the assumption his Jewish audience already understands why they do all that stuff.
Interesting.
Right. Another thing I think about, speaking of Matthew, is how frequently he quotes the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You don't see that as much in Mark.
No, you don't. And what's very interesting, if somebody would read for us the very first verse in the Gospel of Mark, Mark 1, verse 1, that would give us a good launching point.
Yep.
Go for it.
The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
Okay.
Well, mine says the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God.
Okay. Jesus, Messiah, Jesus Christ. Yeah, Christ is the same thing as Messiah.
Okay.
It means anointed one. But the key phrase there is Son of God, because the term Son of God had a specific meaning in Roman culture, didn't it?
Yeah, it was the Caesars.
Yeah, the Caesars were referred to as the Son of God. So now, in the very first verse,
and even the language there, the idea of gospel, at that time, that wasn't a word that Mark invented.
No.
It was a word that was used to describe, hey, Caesar just had a son. Go out and tell everybody, or we won a military victory.
Yeah.
Go out and tell everybody, hey, this is the gospel of Caesar, the Son of God. And then they would talk about the story.
Yeah.
And so Mark's making a very clear statement about, nuh-uh.
And he's going to spend the next 16 chapters proving that. With Mark 1:1 fresh in our minds, somebody give us Mark 15, verse 39. And this is the crucifixion event.
I have it. And when the centurion, who stood there in front of Jesus, saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God.
Now, who's saying that?
The centurion, the Roman centurion.
An official representative of the Roman government affirms Mark's thesis from chapter 1, verse 1.
Wow.
There's so much richness in the way the story is told. We have 4 gospel accounts, but in each case, the same story is told differently to tailor it to the particular audience so that they can understand. Whereas with Matthew, what's the issue with Israel? Well, they're looking for their Messiah king. So the whole theme is Jesus is the king of the Jews. We come to Mark, their whole thing was Caesar being the Son of God. No, Jesus is the Son of God. And I've got it from a Roman centurion that's correct. There's so much in that I think gives weight to the value of audience in all this.
It's understandable to say that Matthew wants to tell Jewish people about their Messiah that they were expecting. But now it's like, okay, Mark is wanting to say, oh, it's not just for them, by the way. Like, and of course, Matthew points that out as well. But the very nature of saying that we want to go global with this message and even relate it to the culture and people outside of just this one particular context is itself a message.
It very much is. And keep in mind that when we position Mark in the book of Acts, as we saw earlier, he was the fulcrum of that conflict between Paul and Barnabas in Acts 15. Well, the last I checked, Acts 15 follows Acts 11, right? And it's in Acts 11 where Peter sees the sheet coming down and don't call common what I have cleansed. And then he's called to the home of a centurion to share the gospel with Gentiles. So all of that was prior to Mark's relationship with Peter. And now, here in Peter's telling of the gospel through Mark, we have this very interesting outreach to the Romans, and to the Romans who need to know about the real Son of God, not the Caesar little s son of little g God, but Jesus, the capital S Son of the living God God. So as we think about the Roman culture, one of the things that causes authors to attribute this to a Roman audience is because there's one word that appears a lot, and it's Elisa's favorite word in the Gospel of Mark. What is it?
Shazam? No, it's immediately.
Immediately. Yeah, the action never stops, and Romans were very action-oriented people. They were constantly on the move. They were spreading the empire. They were expanding the Roman footprint on the planet, and so there was all kinds of action always happening, and that's the way Mark tells the story. After this, immediately this happened. It wasn't, a couple weeks. No, it was immediately. And it just keeps moving forward with a very fast-paced telling of the story. And some other more detailed versus things, he does use several Latin terms instead of using the Greek terms that would have maybe been more common.
Can you explain why that is significant?
Well, for the Roman audience, using a Latin term would have made it more accessible for them.
I see.
Whereas writing to a Greek culture, using a Greek term for that would be more accessible. It's kind of like when I go into a foreign country for the first time, the first two things I try to learn how to say is please and thank you.
Yes.
And the third is where's the bathroom? Those are the things.
Maybe hello.
Yeah, but I mean, when you try to say something in their language,
it's meaningful.
You see a smile.
Right.
It's kind of okay. He's trying here. He's not doing very well, but he's trying. He uses the Roman method of reckoning time, which was counted differently based on the watches of the night, and there are a variety of other things. Like you said, Rasul, there aren't very many Old Testament quotations in there because they wouldn't have had any access to the Old Testament in a Roman culture. And so as we think about all these different characteristics of a Roman audience and how it affects how we read this, can you see why having that information in the back of our minds can enrich the reading of it?
You bet.
That's one of the reasons why I think it helps us to maybe make the effort, and it is an effort, there's some work involved, to make the effort to at least inform ourselves a little bit about the background of these Bible books to the degree that we're able and to the information that's available to us.
Yeah, we're talking about how to read Mark in this edition of the podcast, and that who was his primary intended audience discussion was an important part of this. Knowing that a largely non-Jewish Roman audience is who this was written for, helps us understand what Mark included and didn't include and how we read this account of the life and mission of Jesus. Well, to begin the next part of this discussion, they're going to talk about ghosts. It was in the mid-2010s, amid the rise of dating apps and social media, that a slang term gained some popularity. That term was ghosting. And so what is ghosting?
It's a big deal. That's when you just, forget somebody on social media? Is that right?
You don't forget them. You just
ignore them.
Ignore. You just, and not just on social media, just
in life.
Yes.
You don't return their
respond.
phone calls.
Yes.
You don't return their texts.
Yes.
You don't respond to their posts. Yeah, you ghost them.
And so that's a relatively new use of the word ghost. I think I read that definition was actually added to the dictionary of the English language in 2017. And the reason the group will talk about ghosts and ghosting is because they actually are going to see a relationship between ghost and how to read the Gospel of Mark. Discover how they make that connection after we take time for a word from Our Daily Bread Ministries. And during the series on how to read the Gospels, we're just kind of assuming that you will read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And our hope is that you'll have renewed interest in reading the Scripture as a whole. And we here at Our Daily Bread Ministries, and an aspect of the ministry called the Institute for Bible Reading, have something we think will help with that. It's called Immerse, the Reading Bible. Now, there are several things about this Bible that are different from a traditional Bible. Chapter and verse divisions have been removed. Those, of course, are not part of the inspired text. The order of arrangement has been altered. For example, Mark is grouped with Peter's letters and a similar letter, Jude. Coming out of this episode of the podcast, that makes sense, doesn't it? So I would encourage you to get the Messiah volume of the Immerse Bible, which is the New Testament, and read. A reading plan that we include will get you through the New Testament in either 8 or 16 weeks. And there's an aspect of this also that we think is really important. That is reading in community. There are entire churches and Christian schools that are using Immerse as a way of getting those in those communities to read and read together and talk about what they're reading. People from those larger communities are getting together in small groups and once a week talking about what they're reading. In that sense, it's not so much a Bible study, but it's almost more like a book club. But it is getting people reading, and I think you'd be amazed by how much discussion is generated because people are actually reading the Bible. It's an aspect of Immerse that we are tremendously excited about. And so if you'd like to get a copy of the Immerse Bible, begin by going to ourdailybreadpublishing.org and looking for and ordering a copy of Immerse. And a good starting point would be the Messiah volume of the New Testament. Again, go to ourdailybreadpublishing.org. And so now, what about this seemingly random subject of ghosts? Well, what I think we'll discover is that the connection between how to read Mark and ghost actually has more to do with a noun usage of the term than the verb usage that they were talking about just a moment ago. Let's pick up their conversation about ghosts.
So in the more noun part of a ghost, what's a ghost?
Some kind of spirit being.
Yeah, usually I think from a dead person.
I think that's what we think of it as, yeah.
Right.
An apparition.
Yeah, who's haunting you, from the dead.
And then you have the little ghosts in the Pac-Man video game.
Oh, yeah.
Those little guys in there.
When you got in Dickens, The Ghost of Christmas Past.
Yeah, the ghosts there.
Yep.
There's a actual technical term for the meaning of ghost that has to do with books people write. Sometimes they're ghost writers.
Yep.
And a lot of times you see those in memoirs where it says my life by, and it has some famous person's name. They didn't write one word of that. Somebody else did the actual writing. All of this has bearing on how we read the Gospel of Mark because, as we've already chatted about a couple of times, the vast majority of scholarship believes that Mark wrote his Gospel as a ghost for Peter. And we've already talked about a couple of reasons that contribute to that, but one of the places I'd like to land on to give us some ideas that help support this is in Mark chapter 8, verse 29 through 33.
I can read that. Mark 8, 29 through 33, and he continued by questioning them. So this is Jesus questioning the disciples. But who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said to him, you are the Christ. And he warned them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, but turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's."
Okay, that's kind of from the mountaintop to the valley in 2 verses.
Yes.
He goes from "you are the Christ" to "get behind me, Satan." That's pretty heavy stuff. And one of the things that contributes to the thinking that this is Peter's memories of it is he doesn't give himself a lot of credit, but he does take on his shoulders a lot of blame. This is all happening at Caesarea Philippi, and that's where Jesus asks the question, "Who do people say that I am?" And they talk about, some say you're Jeremiah, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're one of the prophets. Who do you say that I am? Now, Matthew, it's a much bolder statement. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Here it just says you are the Christ. And it's a more abbreviated version. It's still true of what he said, but it's not a complete statement of what he said based on Matthew. So he's not really breaking his arm to pat himself on the back here. And he doesn't include all the other stuff about flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. You're going to be the rock on which I build my church. All that stuff is absent. Peter's not using this as a platform to elevate himself. He's using this as a platform to elevate Jesus. And to do that, he even diminishes himself by following on with the story of when Jesus, for the very first time, unpacks for them his mission, that he has come to die. And Peter, in what we have come to think of as typical Peter fashion, says, "You don't know what you're talking about, Lord. That can't happen. This cannot be."
Right.
And it's almost like, I refuse to allow this to be. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, what does the word Satan mean?
It's the adversary, the one who stands against.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that he's calling him
evil one,
the prince of darkness.
Or that
he's just saying, right now
something.
you're standing in opposition to the very purpose for which I've come. We have a much fuller statement of Jesus' rebuke of Peter than we do of when Peter got it right. And that's one of the reasons why people see this. This is probably Peter telling it, because he's soft-selling himself, but upselling Jesus.
Yeah, it's also interesting, too, because it says Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And we've talked before about an honor-shame culture, and asking a question or rebuking in front of people would basically be an honor-shame contest where you're trying to cause a problem. Here, Peter takes him aside. It's almost like a just one-on-one conversation that obviously shows that Peter believes he's the Messiah, but not in the way that Jesus means he's the Messiah, right? Like Peter's expecting him to rule and reign, potentially push out Rome, set up a throne on earth. And so the idea of him dying is like, yeah, no, that's not how that's going to work.
Well, and the other piece
but it's a secret. It's like almost a one-on-one conversation between Peter and
the
Jesus.
flip side of that is, because it's a one-on-one conversation, who would have known that conversation happened?
Peter.
Peter.
Peter and Jesus.
And I mean, obviously, all of this that we're talking about is information that lives under the umbrella of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
We know the Spirit's involved in the giving us of these gospel records, and we don't want to downplay or diminish any of that, but the human authorship matters. And if Mark's primary source material is Simon Peter, then this encounter becomes really important, because it tells us, in a sense, how Peter's thinking has grown and matured over years of following Jesus long after Jesus had ascended into heaven. And I find that really, really helpful.
Yeah, and one other thing that kind of sets up is the way the whole Gospel of Mark ends, with everyone basically being afraid, not understanding what's really happening. And so you have Peter, a moment where it seems like he gets it, and then we find out he doesn't, sets up the end of the Gospel too, which is like, even then they really didn't get their mind around what was going on.
And I mean, in fairness, who could have?
Exactly.
Right? I mean, they were swimming in deep water.
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes we can underestimate how dramatically different it was for Peter, who had grown up his whole life hearing about a Messiah who was a conquering king, who was going to set things right in the midst of this oppression, to then reveal himself, affirm his identity, and say, I'm going to go die.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that wasn't the way that he understood the plan. One thing that is really striking, though, is how self-deprecating this depiction of, him is. I'm curious how unique or common was that in the ancient world or other writings that we have for someone to be so vulnerable about their shortcomings.
Well, let's think about it just in terms of gospel literature.
Right.
The Gospel of John, we believe, because of a lot of things we'll talk about when we get to John, that it was written by John. And continually in his gospel account, he refers to himself in the third person.
Right.
So there's a kind of a humility there. And I think that we're getting the same thing from Peter here. It's almost like he keeps reminding us, I'm in the story, but the story's not about me. The story's about Jesus. Don't lose Jesus in me telling my relationship with him, because it's about him. It's not about me. And I think that kind of humility is refreshing, especially when we are pretty familiar with how brash Peter could be at times, and even arrogant. I mean, just the very fact, like you said, Daniel, that he takes Jesus aside and kind of chews him out a little bit. I mean, who thinks it's okay to do that with Jesus, right? And then I'm reminded that how many times people in the Bible, when God directly spoke to someone, and they would argue with him. And I'm kind of thinking, okay,
that's bold.
Yeah, these really are humans after all.
And we would never do that.
No.
Never.
No more than 20 times a day.
Right.
So as we look at Mark's message and we see it through the lens of Peter's experience with Jesus, I think it gives it a level of richness, certainly a level of detail that makes it much more personal.
Speaking of all that, John's the only gospel that records Peter's restoration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so interesting. It could be humility that he doesn't include it, but it seems kind of essential.
But Mark's gospel gives a hint to it.
Okay.
Somebody give us Mark 16, verse 7.
Okay.
This is following the resurrection. Mark 16, verse 7.
I got it. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you.
Okay, this is the angel at the tomb, and the women have come to the tomb, and they've found it to be empty, and the angel says, go tell his disciples.
And Peter.
And Peter. So he's singled out there.
This is the only one of the Gospels that records that and Peter part. In that moment, Peter knew that he wasn't going to be thrown away because he blew it with the denials and stuff. I find that so cool. And it's much less meaningful if we don't understand that Mark probably got this from Peter. And years later, it still meant so much to him that the angel took special note to include him back in, even though he had taken himself out.
Important part of our conversation this week about how to read the Gospel of Mark by talking about this account of the life of Jesus, likely being many of Peter's recollections. John Mark using his connection with Peter to access those memories of the events and teachings and years spent with Jesus. In that sense, Mark was kind of a ghostwriter for Peter. Well, in this next segment, they want to focus on some of the strategy and tactical things about how Mark put together this telling of the life of Jesus that will help us as we read his gospel. They'll touch on something called the Messianic secret. Ever heard of that before? Also, Bill has a helpful image that he calls the continental divide that he sees in the book of Mark. Discover what that's about. And then the subject of expectations versus reality. That will come up as well. So it's a full agenda for this next part of How to Read Mark.
Okay, question. Why do people love football so much?
I mean, that's an elite question.
Why do I? I do love football. I really do, but I don't want to talk about it all the time.
Okay.
Not all the time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I will say strategy maybe.
Yeah, to me, it's the game you have to push one team back and back and back into their territory, and then the other team has to try to defend against that. And so the strategy that's involved, I like the fact that there's different sizes of people. This is one of the things I like about
you're
football.
always into
like
that.
there's something for
that.
everybody. There's
Yeah.
the little running back, there's the big offensive line guy, tall, thin receiver. There's some place for everybody.
Yeah.
Some people love it for the spectacle. And some people, like you, Rasul, and me, I like the X's and O's.
Oh,
I like
gosh.
the
hugs and
tactical
kisses?
stuff.
The hugs and kisses.
No, the tactical
Nobody even knows
stuff.
what you're talking about now. Yeah.
X's and O's are how they draw up plays. And for me, I like that stuff, whether it's American football or world football, which Americans call soccer. I like it because of the tactics and understanding our goal is to win the game, to move the other team down the field against their will. And this is how we intend to do that. Tactics are not just a big part of sports, though. Tactics are an important part of communication. All of us do communication publicly at different times. And when you're communicating, you have an idea that you're trying to communicate, and then you have a plan on how you want to get that idea across in hopefully a convincing way. So those are the tactics that you implement to express your idea to the audience. And not surprisingly, we've talked about Mark as the author of the gospel that bears his name, and he has some very definite tactics that he uses in trying to communicate the story of Jesus to a Gentile Roman audience. And let's go back to a text that Daniel read yesterday, and I'm going to ask you to read it again, Daniel. If you would give us Mark chapter 8, verses 29 through 33, because this passage, I think, sets up maybe the big strategy that Mark's trying to accomplish, and then we'll talk about some of the smaller tactics about how he gets it done.
He, Jesus, asked them, the disciples, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, to be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things."
Okay, this text is what I call the continental divide in the Gospel of Mark. A continental divide is where at the top of this mountain range, water flows both directions. So it divides the continent literally as a watershed. And I think this is a continental divide in the Gospel of Mark, because this is the very first time that Jesus describes to them his mission, which is to go, to be rejected, to suffer many things, to be killed, and to rise again. This is the first of 3 times that he describes it very definitively. Up until this point, what's he been doing?
Actions.
Yeah, he's been teaching and he's been healing. And the critical moment comes when he leads his disciples to Caesarea Philippi. Now, here's what I want to suggest to you is the continental divide. The first half of the Gospel of Mark is proving to his disciples who he is. They get to Caesarea Philippi, and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" He wants to know if they've been paying attention. Peter says, "What?
You're the Christ."
You're the Christ. Okay, bingo, you got it right. Now let me tell you why I came. And the whole rest of Mark's Gospel is about why he came. This pivot point in the middle of the Gospel of Mark, up to this point, Mark is explaining all the reasons we should believe his thesis statement in chapter 1, verse 1. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Okay, well, why should we believe that? Well, look at what he did, and he recounts all these miracles that Jesus performed and all of these words that Jesus said and taught. And now they come to Caesarea Philippi, and it's kind of like, okay, Peter gets it. Now let's move on to the mission. Because he didn't come to teach and to heal, although he did a lot of teaching and a lot of healing. His primary mission was all about the cross.
Also, that continental divide helps me to understand the tension within Peter even more. You know, you think about the Roman centurion, right, who Jesus says has this great faith. Why? Because he says, I can just heal you from afar. I don't even need to be there. So in the Roman mindset, this demonstration of authority, of power, is the indication that I should listen to you. So yet you just establish that, but then you say, I am going to have things done to me. Crucifixion, suffering. That doesn't sound like authority to Peter.
And then goes on to describe it. If you want to become my followers, let you deny yourselves, take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. And so you have this idea of not only are these things going to be done to me, but those who follow me are also going to be those who have these things done to them too.
Now, there's an interesting little side note, and we talked about it a little bit off mic in the passage that Daniel read when Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." The next verse is, and he warned them to tell no one about him. Why? Well, because it wasn't time for that yet. And this is what scholars refer to as the Messianic secret. And this happens a number of times, especially in the early portions of Mark, where Jesus would tell somebody, don't tell anybody about this. Like when he heals the leper, he says, don't tell anybody about this, but go and show yourself to the priest as proof that you've been healed. And that happens repeatedly. And you say, well, if he had come to reveal himself to the world, why doesn't he want them to reveal him to the world? Because what he has come to do with the cross is so out of step of what their expectations are if they know who he is. Again, we've talked many times here on Discover the Word about the messianic expectation that Israel had versus the messianic reality of who Jesus was. They're expecting a conquering king, and Jesus came to be a sacrificial lamb. And you can't get too much further apart than those two ideas.
So your continental divide is based on actually verse 29 to 30, when Peter says you're the Messiah, and then Jesus warns them not to tell anyone. That is the identity of who Jesus is. And we move from that point into what he
came to do, which was to go to the cross. And that's why, again, as we saw in our first conversation, the Gospel of Mark in particular is referred to as a passion narrative with an extended introduction. The extended introduction was validating Jesus' identity. The passion narrative was explaining his mission. And that's tactically what Mark's trying to communicate with Peter's memories of his time with Jesus, is that Jesus came to be, I'm going to use John's language here, the Lamb of God who would take away the sins of the world, not a conquering king who would drive out Rome and reestablish the Jewish monarchy. That wasn't his mission this time.
Maybe just to go back to your illustration about football at the beginning, for some who are not that football-oriented, to understand the tactics that Mark is employing, I was thinking as we were unpacking all of that, why do I watch football too? Why I watch most sports? I enjoy the games and stuff, but I love the stories. I love the stories behind the players. I love the stories. And so when I look at how the NFL, if you will, tells the story of football, it helps me appreciate what's happening. And so taking that facet or that template and looking at Mark, and this helps me understand the tactics in what he's doing. He's focusing in on the identity of Jesus, and next he'll go into the work of Jesus.
And to your point, how he tells the identity of Jesus is through a series of interactions with other people. So he tells other people's stories in order to tell Jesus' story.
Yes.
And that's how we usually share this about Jesus and about what he's done for us or in us or around us. We share our stories. And that's kind of often our tactic for sharing about him with others too.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Daniel, because so many times you talk about the concept of sharing your faith, and they get all antsy and nervous, and I could never do that. You don't have to be prepared to answer every theological question. All you need to be able to tell them is what Jesus did for you. Just tell them your story. That's always the best starting point.
Tell your story in order to tell the story.
Some of the strategy and tactics that Mark used to enact that strategy and how he put together an account of the life of Jesus. And after we take this short break, we will wrap up this episode on how to read the Gospel of Mark. And in that part of the conversation, an interesting question will come up. What if Mark was the only gospel that we had? His was the only account of the life of Jesus. I know that's hypothetical. We have more. but what if? Well, stay with us for the last 12-minute segment of this Discover the Word podcast. But did you know that you can play an important role in communicating the life-transforming story of Jesus that we read in the Gospels and the whole Bible all around the world? You really can. Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global, nonprofit, donor-supported organization committed to making the Bible a vital part of your everyday life. Through audio conversations like this, a video, print, the internet, a variety of methods, literally millions of people around the world are encouraged to live out their relationship with Jesus. And with your help, we can reach even more. So can I ask you to consider partnering with us financially to continue telling the story of Jesus and making the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to people all around the world? You can do that by checking out the Donate tab on our website. Go to discovertheword.org and click Donate. That's at discovertheword.org. And now let's conclude this conversation that's helping us know how to read Mark.
Okay, we started off the last conversation talking about football. I'm going to start talking about it again, but it has nothing to do with actual football and how it's played or anything. I promise.
Okay.
It's one of the things that makes it oftentimes so much better to watch it at home on TV than to be in the actual stadium. Because when you watch it on TV, at every NFL game, there are 15 to 20 cameras positioned around the stadium.
Yes.
And there are like 150 to 200 production people supporting that broadcast at every single game. And what those 15 to 20 cameras do is they give us perspectives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like when they have a play, they show it from 5 or 6 different angles. And you get the same result every time, but you get a little bit different idea about what happened and why from all the different perspectives.
Yeah, and if we want to expand that idea, we can think of concerts of those bands that you could never afford to get good seats for, right? So you'd be up in the nosebleeds. It's nice watching something like that, either later from home or during from home, because it's like you're on the third row of the concert.
You could actually apply that to church.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. As somebody that's not that tall, you know what I mean? It's nice to have a big screen that you could turn to sometimes.
You can see the preacher. Yeah.
What we're talking about is perspective. And as we talk about the Gospels, the reason we have 4 different Gospels is we get 4 different perspectives on the story of Jesus. We've talked about this kind of in passing before, but the reality is all 4 of the Gospels tell the same story, but they tell it very differently at times. And we've talked about the fact that Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, so he uses a lot of Old Testament scripture. He doesn't explain any Jewish customs. There are a lot of things like that. Mark, we believe, is writing to a Roman audience, so there's a lot of action, very little emphasis on the Old Testament at all. And he explains Jewish customs to his Gentile audience. So a very different perspective, and that's why I'm glad we have 4 Gospels and not just one Gospel.
Yes.
Because it gives her a richer, more 3-dimensional perspective.
4-dimensional.
Yeah.
Which is true. At the same time, though, if we think about the earliest people that received these, oftentimes they would only have one.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that was the picture that they got of Jesus. And so having it tell the same story differently means that each group that was receiving whichever gospel it was still seeing the same story, but from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, because if you think about it, all 4 are telling the same story. It's true in each of the 4 Gospels. It is correct and accurate in each of the 4 Gospels, but it's told differently. And to your point, Daniel, I think I've mentioned it before, probably years ago, but I read a book once on the 4 Gospels, and the last section in each chapter, what if this was the only gospel? And so you think about that, we're talking about the Gospel of Mark. What if Mark was the only gospel we had? Well, we wouldn't celebrate Christmas.
Because he doesn't even talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a non-issue. Matthew and Luke start with birth narratives. Mark starts with Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. John starts, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So you're starting at a very different place to tell the same story in a very different way. And so as we've been kind of trying to wrestle with Mark a little bit this week to get a sense of what he's trying to do, and how he's trying to do it, to the people he's trying to tell it to, we want to wrap up by talking about one final component to all this. And that's going to be found in Mark chapter 8, verses 34 through 36. And Daniel, you read this to us. It's right after the text we've read in the last two programs about Caesarea Philippi. Who do you say that I am? You're the Christ. Okay, I'm going to go. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be killed. And I'm going to rise the third day. And then after the little one-on-one moment that Jesus and Peter had, this is what comes next. Mark 8, 34 through 36. You want to get it?
Yeah, I got it.
Good.
And he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?"
Okay. You talk about a buzzkill. And Mark's not the only gospel that records it, but we talked in our last conversation about this continental divide where the first half sets up who Jesus is, his identity. The second half really explains for us his mission, what he came to do. The third piece is what does he ask of us? And here, it's really strategic that this follows his first explanation of his mission to suffer as the sacrifice for the sins of the people. Then he says, I want you to deny yourself. He's not saying that in a vacuum. He's saying that against the backdrop of his own greater suffering for us. He says, you have to deny yourself. Now, how would a Roman audience have heard that, do you think?
Oh, man, that sounds like the opposite of what triumph or authority or winning is.
Yeah.
It sounds like slavery, which is the bottom rung of Roman society.
Yeah.
And the idea of taking up a cross would have been very vivid. And
The criminality of it all.
yeah, the criminality, the shame, the torture, the absolute pain. I mean, so many different layers of that. Often people who were against Rome were crucified to make a statement about this is what happens if you stand against Rome. So all of that would be tied up even in just that one word, cross.
And to take that one step further, Daniel, Romans were never executed by crucifixion. That was only for non-Romans. A Roman citizen could not be crucified. They would be executed other ways like beheading or something like that. But only non-Romans were subject to crucifixion. And so writing to a Roman audience and saying, I don't care what the government says, there's a cross for you too. That's a hard saying.
That's powerful, Bill.
So when you look at all that, the whole idea of gentle Jesus, meek and mild doesn't really resonate, does it? Mark's Jesus is a very robust, dare I say, muscular Jesus who not only is willing to give himself to the nth degree, he asks his followers to go and do likewise. And the medium of the cross is the consistent factor between both of those things. When Matthew describes Jesus as the King of the Jews, it has a very different feel than Mark describing him as the suffering servant.
Now that phrase, suffering servant, that doesn't really show up in Mark. It's kind of an interpretive, I guess.
What you get in Mark is Jesus saying, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many.
Yeah.
So yes, the exact phrase suffering servant doesn't appear, but the concept is there very, very clearly.
Yeah, and I like that connection between suffering and serving.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In a sense of essentially subjugating one's sense of wanting to be exalted underneath the greater goal of the kingdom of God of serving others. And there's an aspect of suffering in that, but it's like Jesus is saying that is where the true triumph comes, not in the Roman way, not in the way of domination, but in a way of emptying yourself in order to allow God to fill you.
That's right. And to take that back even a little bit further, just that phrase, he must deny himself. I mean, much of Rome was based on an Epicurean lifestyle, which meant the whole purpose of life was to experience pleasure. The idea of denying self was countercultural for them.
Backwards, totally.
And perhaps something we can relate to. living in a culture that is about pleasure and
Yeah.
experiencing the good life and eating at restaurants where, whether it's overpriced tacos or whatever, right? Like, we are all about pleasure, and even our phones are designed for us, me, myself, and my setup and my home screen and what I want to do. And if you bore me, I'll just get on my phone and focus on what I want. And I mean, just all of that's tied together.
Yeah, and it feels like Jesus's demonstration of true life in the cross goes against both of the impulses we see in Rome, because you do see the Epicurean kind of hedonistic participate, but you also see on the other side the very stoic, discipline, control. Like, I can control my environment, and that's where life comes from. And he says, actually, through the cross, neither of those are the way. There's a better way, a different way. And that way is through suffering. That way is through submitting oneself to the greater call of God and his kingdom, which may sometimes involve either of those things, the enjoyment of things that might cause people to say, like they accuse Jesus of being a glutton, right? Or on the other hand, you're too extreme. And I think the way of Jesus seems to be higher than either of those.
Yeah.
Taking this back to John Mark and Peter as his source, how do we see this message of suffering, of taking up the cross, fulfilled in how they lived out their faith?
Well, they lived the lives of disciples, not to the same degree or way that Paul did, but they traveled the known world of their day, lived lives of austerity, and according to church tradition, and we don't know if this is historical fact or just church tradition, but again, the church tradition is that Peter ultimately was crucified upside down because he didn't feel he was worthy to be crucified the same way Jesus was.
I just think that when we're looking at a gospel and we start off with the authorship and then we go into the other things like tactics, etc., it's powerful to kind of circle back and realize these were real people who witnessed.
And what they saw was transformative enough that it made them willing to do that. To me, that's one of the biggest evidences of the reality of the resurrection, is that these guys went from hiding in fear in an upper room, afraid that the next cross was going to be theirs, to out in public proclaiming, this Jesus whom you crucified with wicked hands, and just really represented Jesus boldly and passionately to the very crowd, in a sense, that had enabled him to be put on a cross. I think that transformational reality of the resurrection is so huge and so powerful that it's the only thing that really can explain how the Simon Peter of "Get thee behind me, Satan" could become the Simon Peter of Acts chapter 2 and the preaching on the day of Pentecost. And I think you're right, Elisa, when we loop back and look at their stories in the light of the story of Jesus, we see that transformation. And we also see Jesus, who didn't just say, this is what you have to do. It's Jesus who said, this is what I'm going to do first. And then, by the way, there's a cross for you as well.
And I think that was a really helpful hour of conversations about how to read the Gospel of Mark. Hope you learned a lot, and that you have a solid foundation and understanding of some things that will help you read with more understanding and enlightenment. And we can be thankful that we don't have just this one gospel. There are 4 accounts we have at the beginning of the New Testament of the life and message and mission of Jesus that together are some of the most influential documents in history. And they're also so crucial to your history and your relationship with God through Jesus. Well, Bill Crowder, Elisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, and Rasul Berry around the table with you. And in the next episode, we will devote our time to understanding how to read the Gospel according to Luke. I think you'll find that conversation just as helpful. How to read what the only non-Jewish, only Gentile contributor to the New Testament wrote, and how that shaped what he wrote. How to read Luke, next time. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Hettinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.